All right, so my name is Tucker Feyder. I'm a project manager with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers out of the Northwest Colorado branch located in the Grand Junction field office. We also have field offices in Durango, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, and Denver, Colorado. Split into two different districts at the moment. We have the Omaha district, which encompasses the Denver field office, and then the Albuquerque district, which encompasses Grand Junction, Pueblo, and Durango. The purpose of this presentation today was hoping to just kind of touch on some common general permits and exemptions we see in the agricultural field. Hopefully this will be useful when you're out in the field working on ditches and diversions and things like that, to kind of give you a general feel for when you might need a permit, when you might be exempt, and hopefully just so you feel comfortable talking to the Corps if you ever have any questions that should arise. So as I just stated, some of the objectives here today are to touch on some of the common exemptions we see in the agricultural field, as well as some of the general permits, nationwide permits and regional general permits that are most commonly used in Colorado. The Corps' mission, of course, is to balance development with protection of the aquatic environment. I think it's important to note that the Corps is not a proponent or opponent of any project. We're simply here to enforce the Clean Water Act and all the regulations associated with that. So Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, this is where the Corps derives their regulatory authority over freshwater resources. Purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of these waters. And waters of the U.S. as defined at 33 CFR Part 328, also known as jurisdictional waters of the U.S., include oceans, rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, some wetlands, and some springs. In rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds, our jurisdiction begins at the ordinary high water mark. Anything below the ordinary high water mark is considered jurisdictional under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. Beyond the ordinary high water mark, when you get into wetlands, our jurisdiction begins at that kind of the boundary between where the wetlands kind of transition into upland. It's known as a delineation. We'll go out and delineate boundaries, or consultants can delineate those boundaries. And that kind of gives us a starting point as to where we might start regulating a project. Two things need to occur for a project to be regulated by the Corps. We need activity jurisdiction, which is a discharge of fill material in this case. We need geographic jurisdiction. So this would be the waters of the US. If you're discharging fill material into uplands, you may have triggered the activity jurisdiction, but we don't have geographic jurisdiction, that is, in uplands. So a permit is not required for something like that. On the flip side, there's a few activities that we don't regulate, such as above ground vegetation clearing, for example. So that activity is not regulated. So even if you're doing above ground vegetation clearing in a geographically jurisdictional resource, such as a wetland, you've not triggered both parts of this test. Still no permit required. A permit would be required if you are going to discharge that fill material into a geographic waters of the US, such as rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, wetlands. So delineation, an aquatic resource delineation, often referred to as a wetland delineation, just identifies the boundaries and acreage of any aquatic resource that might be in a review area. It does not make any claims towards jurisdiction yet. We can verify these things. We call them aquatic resource delineation verifications, where the Corps will confirm or concur with a delineation. We can go out and say, yes, we concur with, that's where the wetland ends. This is where uplands begin. If your project's up in the uplands, no permit required from that point on. On the flip side, if you're down in the wetlands, potentially need a permit, or we can look for an exemption, things like that. It just kind of determines where that boundary is, where that line is between upland and wetland, or the ordinary high water mark. It kind of determines that boundary of where jurisdiction might begin for us. And then jurisdictional determinations. We don't get into these a whole lot on the West Slope. I know they're a little more prominent on the Front Range. They do quite a few more jurisdictional determinations. This is a legal determination that the Corps is making based on a delineation that an aquatic resource is or is not jurisdictional. It's basically a yes, no, a snapshot in time. Yes, this area contains waters of the U.S., or no, it does not. This can help with permitting options. If a resource is non-jurisdictional, no permit required for activities within that resource. But within Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, there are a few activities that are not regulated that I'd like to touch on. Most common non-regulated activities are those that are considered exempt under Section 404F of the Clean Water Act. And I'll go a little bit more into those on the next slide. Those are things like your maintenance exemption, your irrigation exemption. A couple other items that are non-regulated activities for the Corps are excavation activities that contain incidental fallback only. You might hear this referred to as clean excavation or excavation only. So this would mean, excavation where the only discharge of fill would be incidental fallback coming, say, out of the bucket, kind of like that picture on the upper right. And this is assuming that that material is cleanly excavated, as clean as possible at least, and disposed of in an upland area. If you were to sidecast that into, say, a wetland or somewhere else within an aquatic resource, that would be a discharge of fill that would then become a regulated activity. Clean excavation, dredging material straight out of the ground and cleanly disposing of it in an upland location, that meets the excavation only definition, and therefore there would be no discharge of fill. We have no regulatory authority yet. The second there is a discharge of fill, that triggers the Corps regulatory authority, and there better be a permit or an exemption with it. Another non-regulated activity we see is cutting of vegetation above the ground, no root disturbance. It's kind of like mowing, things like that. That picture on the upper left is a pretty good example. As long as there's no, deep ripping of roots with massive amounts of ground disturbance, as long as you don't have that and it's above the ground, there's no discharge of fill associated with it, no permit required. Another item, piling, for example, say like a driven post, a fence post or something like that. Those aren't typically regulated unless they have the effect of fill. So if you were to stack up, say, a couple dozen posts all within close proximity, so they gathered sediment, slowed the flow of water, altered the circulation, things like that, that has the effect of fill. We may have to step in and regulate that. But say, cattle exclusion fencing, something like that, if they're just on pilings, doesn't have the effect of fill, non-regulated activity from the Corps' perspective. So I'll touch on a few of our most common exemptions. Actually, this list is all of our exemptions right here. The normal farming exemption, maintenance exemption, construction or maintenance of farm and stock ponds, that's also known as our irrigation exemption. Construction of temporary sediment basins on a construction site, activities authorized by Section 208B4 of the Clean Water Act, or construction or maintenance of farm roads, forest roads, or mining roads, temporary mining roads, that is. Those are all the Section 404F exemptions that the Corps has under the Clean Water Act. Permits are not required for these actions as long as you meet the exemption. And part of meeting that exemption is what's referred to as the recapture provision. A permit is required if it's part of an activity whose purpose is to convert an area of waters of the U.S. into a use to which it was not previously subject. This would mean where the flow or circulation of waters have been impaired or the reach is reduced. And that's a two-part test there. So if the flow and circulation is impaired and the reach is reduced, you've triggered both parts of the recapture provision, and a permit would be met. So, it is possible to maybe alter the flow, say with a diversion structure. Theoretically, you shouldn't be reducing the reach of those waters. Therefore, the recapture provision wouldn't have been met yet. And I'll go a little bit more into that here in a couple of slides when we get into the irrigation exemption. But the recapture provision is kind of one way that you can get booted out of an exemption. Again, that's if you're altering the flow and circulation of waters of the U.S., as well as reducing the reach of those waters. So our maintenance exemption, we've got a photo of apples and oranges here. The maintenance exemption really is the replacement of a currently serviceable structure, and that replacement needs to be like for like or apples for apples. It cannot be apples for oranges. For example, if you need to replace a 10-inch pipe, it needs to be replaced with a 10-inch pipe of similar character, scope, and size. You cannot go back and replace it with a bigger structure, that's outside of the original fill design. It's got to be the same exact fill design. So some items that often qualify for maintenance exemptions are dikes, dams, levees, groins, riprap, breakwaters, causeways, bridge abutments or approaches, and transportation structures. Particularly after an emergency occurs, this maintenance exemption allows for emergency reconstruction of things like dams, causeways, levees, riprap, bridge abutments, all that. assuming you're going to put it back, how it was before, apples for apples. It cannot be, it cannot go outside of the original fill design. So there's some gray area in the maintenance exemption, but the one area that is black and white is the apples for apples clause, or the like for like. It's got to be replaced in kind within the original fill design. Where we get a little bit outside of that can be the irrigation exemption. This exemption is for the construction or maintenance of farm and stock ponds and irrigation ditches, or the maintenance of drainage ditches. Also included in this exemption are discharges associated with siphons, pumps, head gates, swing walls, weirs, diversion structures, and other facilities as are pertinent and functionally related to the irrigation ditch. Those are all included in the exemption. Common feature, that photo on the left, a diversion structure. Water is diverted to the ditch there, kind of in the foreground, but in the background, the river is still able to flow through. It's not totally choking off the river. It's not reducing the reach. That river is still able to flow to its ultimate destination. Our exemptions are all reviewed on a case-by-case basis, so it's always helpful to reach out, even if you're fairly certain. Because even if you are fairly certain, if you let us know and we know you're going to be in there creating a diversion structure or replacing a head gate, something like that, and we get a call from, say, a nosy neighbor or something like that, we'll know that that's going on, and it won't raise any immediate red flags. We'll kind of know, hey, he's in there working in the river, he's exempt, it's for his irrigation ditch. As far as these ditches go, what constitutes an irrigation ditch versus, say, a municipal or industrial M&I water supply. As a general rule of thumb, greater than 50% of the water conveyed in the ditch should be used for agricultural purposes, an ultimate agricultural purpose. If it's a split party ditch where half the water's for M&I and half is for agriculture, and it's the M&I component wanting to do the work, they're not going to qualify for the exemption. They're going to need a permit for that. The purpose for the work is solely related for agricultural purposes, then it's going to meet the exemption. But it's got to have that kind of, at least 50% need or 50% use heading towards agricultural purposes. So the general definition, construction or maintenance of farm and stock ponds. Maintenance can mean the removal of accumulated debris and sediment from a pond or ditch. This allows you to dredge or clean a pond or ditch that is kind of sedimented in or filled in with debris or any other sediment. It's kind of a tricky spot, but where we draw that line between what's considered a pond and, say, a reservoir is somewhere between 15 to 20 surface acres. And this is kind of also dependent on the size of the farm or ranch using the water. This is to kind of help us prevent a situation where, at one point someone constructs a 25 surface acre pond, or we technically call it a reservoir at that point. But someone constructs a 25 surface acre reservoir, and it's all exempt, no permit required or anything like that. And then the property sells, and now that pond is the focal point of a residential subdivision. That residential subdivision is now going to require an individual permit, which is a more substantial, time-consuming permitting mechanism as opposed to an exemption or a general permit. So this is to kind of try to avoid that. There's been some precedent set that 15 to 20 surface acres is kind of the cutoff between a pond and a reservoir. Pond maintenance is covered by the irrigation exemption. Reservoir maintenance, possibly not. But again, case-by-case basis, reach out to your project manager. Reservoir maintenance will likely be covered by a nationwide permit 3, which I will touch on a little bit later. This is kind of a hot topic within the past 2 years. Ditch to pipe conversions, very common in Colorado, especially salinity and selenium control projects. However, on July 24th, 2020, the Corps and the EPA issued a joint memo to the field regarding irrigation exemptions, and there's some specific language in there regarding ditch to pipe conversions. Specifically, that language determined that the conversion of a jurisdictional ditch into a pipe is changing the use of that water, and by definition also reducing the water's reach, which would trigger the recapture provision. And that they kind of didn't leave any gray area in there for us to say otherwise. It's kind of a blanket statement that this always meets the recapture provision. A permit is always required for a ditch to pipe conversion. A jurisdictional ditch to pipe conversion. Not all ditches are jurisdictional. However, in Colorado, ditch to pipe conversions may be permitted by Regional General Permit number 5, which was recently created in response to this memo, which covers ditch-related activities in the state of Colorado. These are the main types of Corps of Engineer regulatory permits. There's two main types: individual permits or general permits. Individual permits are a lot harder to get. They require an alternatives analysis, all sorts of stuff, cumulative impact assessments. It's just a much more intensive process for larger scale, higher impact projects. I mean, there's two types of individual permits: standard permit or letters of permission. Letters of permission are kind of expedited standard permit, if you will. Unfortunately, there are none available for use in the state of Colorado at the moment. However, standard permits always an option for those larger impact projects. On the right-hand side there in the red, these are the easier to get permits, our general permits. There's three main types. We do not have any programmatic general permits in the state of Colorado, but we do have regional general permits. And we also have nationwide permits. Nationwide permits are exactly what they sound like. They're issued at the nationwide level for use on lower impact projects that have been determined at at the nationwide level. They're not going to be highly impactful. Similar deal with regional general permits. However, these are on a regional basis. Most of the time they follow state lines. However, there are some smaller regional general permits that are specific to, say, the South Platte River. There's a regional general permit for the Denver area specific to the Mile High Flood District on the South Platte River. Fort Carson's got their own regional permit. Colorado Springs has one of their own regional permits for, I believe it's for ephemeral drainages or flood control. Other regional general permits in the state of Colorado are open to the general public, the state of Colorado, such as RGP 5. So just to touch again on nationwide permits, there's about 52 of them. There's actually a couple more now. We issued a couple new ones on this last round, so I need to update this slide. But we recently reissued them on March 5th. They get reissued about every 5 years. Sometimes they'll get modified before the 5-year mark, but the permit, once it's issued, is good until the end of that 5-year period. So March 14, 2026. If you got a permit today, it'll be valid till March 14 of 2026. And so these nationwide permits, the activities must meet the general conditions that are associated with all of the nationwide permits, in addition to regional conditions that are proposed and set forth by individual districts. So, and they're usually state specific. So regional conditions pertain to Colorado, and then say New Mexico has their own regional conditions, Utah's got their own. So in addition to the general conditions, you have to abide by regional conditions, and there could be special conditions added onto a permit if you're in, for example, working around endangered species or historic properties, something like that. There can be special conditions added on, or if mitigation is required. So these are all of our nationwide permits currently available for use. I've highlighted two of them here that I'm going to touch on a little bit. Nationwide Permit 3 for maintenance, Nationwide Permit 13 for bank stabilization. Some of these nationwide permits, as you'll see in the later slides, have the potential to be what's referred to as non-reporting or non-notifying. Non-notifying means that a pre-construction notification, or PCN as it's abbreviated, is not required. That the permit's been authorized for use. And as long as you abide by the general conditions and regional conditions, you can use that permit without submitting a pre-construction notification to our office. Two of the big general conditions that might prevent a project from being non-notifying are the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. If you're in the vicinity of or have the potential to affect an endangered species or a potentially historic site, unfortunately, the project doesn't comply with the general conditions at that point, and you would have to submit a pre-construction notification to the Corps to ensure that those resources, whether they're an endangered species or historic property, are not going to be adversely impacted. So again, this is another good reason to coordinate with your local regulatory project manager, because they should have pretty good knowledge of whether your project site is in the vicinity of any endangered species. And we have the ability to kind of look into and see if there are any known historical sites in the area that might prevent your project from being non-notifying. So definitely give us a call or shoot us an email, and we can help you kind of navigate that So Nationwide Permit 3, this is for maintenance, and this nationwide permit covers maintenance projects that may not qualify for the exemption. You may recall that the maintenance exemption is apples for apples. Well, the maintenance nationwide permit 3 allows for some minor deviations, whether that's due to changes in materials or new construction techniques, or maybe another regulatory agency has a requirement, a city, a county, a state, whoever. This nationwide permit covers those projects that may not meet that exemption. Fairly easy permit to get. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, this permit does allow for some activities to be non-notifying. There's a paragraph on all of our nationwide summaries that speak to the notification parameters. So specifically for nationwide permit 3, only activities authorized by paragraph B of this nationwide permit, which is the dredging, removal of accumulated sediments. That's the only activity associated with Nationwide 3 that requires pre-construction notification, unless you're in the vicinity of an endangered species or have the potential to affect endangered species or historic property. So for some of those, you may recall I mentioned the pond maintenance with the irrigation exemption. You can maintain a pond under the exemption, but if you're working with a larger body of water, such as a reservoir, it's likely you'll need to come in under Nationwide Permit 3. And since it's Nationwide Permit 3B for the removal of accumulated sediments, a pre-construction notification would be required for something like that. And again, that cutoff between what we consider a pond and a reservoir is right around between 15 to 20 surface acres. So again, if you're kind of in that range and hoping to come under an exemption or wanting to know if you need to apply for the permit, please don't hesitate to reach out to your local regulatory office, and we can kind of point you in the right direction as far as an exemption or this Nationwide Permit 3B. And we can also help you out with filling out the PCN. Another commonly used nationwide permit in Colorado, especially around diversion structures and head gates, things like that. Typically, you can maintain your structure within 200 feet of the structure. You can qualify for the maintenance exemption. If you go beyond that, it kind of starts looking to us like its own project. For example, bank stabilization within the immediate vicinity of a head gate or a wing wall or something like that might qualify for a maintenance exemption or irrigation exemption. But you start getting beyond, the scope of the head gate, and you need to stabilize a bank elsewhere. That's kind of considered its own project and would require a nationwide permit 13 for bank stabilization. Again, this nationwide permit has an opportunity for being non-notifying, assuming that the materials that you're discharging are not going into a special aquatic site, and this includes wetlands. So you're discharging below the ordinary high water mark, not into wetland, and you're not discharging in excess of 500 feet in length of treated bank below the ordinary high water mark. Anything above the ordinary high water mark, again, is considered uplands. We don't worry about that. If you're in uplands, you haven't triggered a core permit. It's not till you get below the ordinary high water mark. So that's where our kind of calculations for these thresholds begin. So in excess of 500 feet in length along the treated bank, or greater than an average of 1 cubic yard per running foot. Go above either of those parameters, unfortunately, you've triggered the need to submit a pre-construction notification. Again, just to reiterate, if you can avoid wetlands, keep it below 500 feet in length along the treated bank, and keep it below an average of 1 cubic yard per running foot, it's possible that pre-construction notification won't be required, again, unless you're in the vicinity of or have the potential to affect an endangered species or historic property. And once again, just to really drive the point home, feel free to reach out. We can help point you in the right direction as far as what endangered species may or may not be in the vicinity of your project, and same with potential historic properties. We can kind of give you an idea and let you know if your project will qualify for a non-notifying nationwide, or if again you're going to need to submit a PCN. So those are the two nationwides I really wanted to touch on. Now we'll kind of get into regional general permits. Again, these are similar to the nationwides. However, they're specific to a state or region. For the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to highlight Regional General Permit 5 here, which allows for the construction of irrigation ditches, relocation or realignment of existing ditches, converting existing ditches into pipes, filling ditches, or lining and armoring ditches. This was created last year in response to that memo put out by the Corps and the EPA, just to cover those activities that were no longer considered exempt. This RGP-5 was kind of sort of designed to be a catch-all for those projects, and there are some non-notifying parameters associated with this regional general permit, specifically if you're working with another federal agency like the NRCS or Bureau of Reclamation. Most of those projects are going to be non-notifying but reporting. And the distinction there is you don't need to fill out the pre-construction notification. You just kind of need to tell us what you're doing and that you have this partnership with NRCS or BOR or whoever. We can confirm that you meet the parameters of RGP-5. Some of the other regional general permits in the state of Colorado: channel maintenance and construction on the South Platte, Fort Carson Pinyon Canyon maneuver site, erosion control activities. City of Colorado Springs has their own. Two other ones that can be utilized in the state of Colorado by any of the general public are RGP 37 for stream stabilization projects and RGP 96 for natural disaster mitigation or flood related activities. Both the RGP 37 and 96 require submittal of a PCN every time. RGP 37 is similar to Nationwide Permit 13, where it's for bank stabilization. However, this is for kind of your larger bank stabilization projects. This allows up to 1,000 linear feet and 2 cubic yards per running foot. So it's kind of double the Nationwide Permit 13. However, you will have to submit a pre-construction notification every time under this permit. This is kind of what the PCN looks like. It's 6 pages. However, only the first 3 pages have anything really substantial on them. The key items that we're looking for are the project description, the purpose and need. Why do you need to do this project? Why does it need to be in waters of the U.S.? Why can't it be in uplands? The quantity of waters impacted, either square footage or acreage, cubic yards of materials dredged or discharged into those waters, proposed mitigation measures you considered or are implementing, and then if there are any known impacts or potential impacts to endangered species or historic properties. Again, we can help you fill this out if you need, and we're more than happy to help walk you through this. With that, here's how to get in contact with us. If you're in the Denver area on the Front Range, you're in the Omaha district. For the Albuquerque district, we have a general mailbox for all 3 of our Albuquerque district offices. So if you have a project and you don't know who your point of contact is, feel free to submit it to that email address, and one of us will get you pointed in the right direction. You'll be assigned a project manager, and we can help work you through any questions you might have in regards to exemptions, or is my ditch jurisdictional, or do I need a permit? Am I non-notifying? Things like that. Again, early coordination can save both of us time and effort